Let's go to Nahum chapter 1, and we'll pick up where we left off last time in verse 10. He says, "For while they be folden together as thorns, and while they are drunken as drunkards, they shall be devoured as stubble, fully dry." While they're folden together as thorns. The idea of folding together is interesting because it really speaks of being entwined. You and I have seen one of the easiest things for me to think about is my little goatee, as little as it is, to comb in it. It'll get tangled a little bit, and so you start combing and it pulls and it hurts, doesn't it? You feel that little tingle where the hair gets pulled. That's the general idea of this word, to entwine, to fold together, to wrap something. When we think about the roots of a tree, they'll tend to wrap around. If there's a boulder underneath the tree, they'll tend to wrap around that boulder. And it gives the tree strength to stand in storms. Also, the idea of fold together. And I think you are starting to get a picture of where I'm headed with this. When you fold something together, when the ancients made swords, they learned that if they beat it down real thin and then folded it together and then beat it again and kept folding it, it made it stronger and stronger and stronger, the metal. Well, that's the idea here. It's used to describe the way the roots of a plant or a tree cling together and entangle themselves to help strengthen the base for the tree to grow. And that's how Nineveh felt about themselves. We're strong. Why? We've got all of these alliances. We have all of these powers, and we have all of this strength of armies. And we're strong. We can't be defeated. And so really there are two ideas with regard to the thorns that are promoted among those who are scholars. Thorns were used in Israel and Far East nations to grow hedges where they would keep their sheep at night. Now, the reason they used these thorn bushes is because once they entangled themselves and grew together, well, the sheep wouldn't get out, and a wolf couldn't get in without getting torn up. And so they were safe. The sheep were safe. Nineveh felt that way. We've got we're like folding together thorns that have made a barrier where the enemy can't get through. We can keep out the enemies with the defenses that we have. But thorns are also something that's an irritant. They're harmful, they hurt. Probably all of us have been poked by a thorn at one time or another. It may have been a rose or a thorn bush or something, but we've all been poked, or blackberry bushes. That's how I used to get torn up all the time. Granny'd send us out to get some blackberries, and you knew, uh-oh, not only are the thorns going to get you, but the chiggers are probably going to get you too. But the thorns are an irritant many times, and they thought that they could be irritant enough to the nations around them that they'd leave them alone. And there seems to be little doubt that the text is using this in the idea of irritants that were protective in nature, that dissuaded an enemy from trying to conquer them, to protect them in this way. Roper said something here that I thought was interesting. He said, "Nineveh may have been hurtful like thorns and drunken on the presumption of its own power, but it would be burned up like dry stubble or chaff." All of us have probably seen farmers at times when the hay fields have been all gathered, and in the fall when they get dry, and then the farmers sometimes, they used to do this a lot, they don't do it as much anymore, would then burn the fields. And it just like that, it goes up. It's just that quick. It, boom, goes up. Well, Nineveh perceived themselves to be strong, but notice what God's saying. They're going to be destroyed as easily as fully dried thorns and stubble in a fire. Well, what happens when the fire burns all of the stubble? It becomes little powdery stuff, and the wind can just blow it away. Much like the chaff that came from the seeds. For instance, wheat seeds. The way that the wheat was separated from the chaff in ancient times is they would beat it, the sheaves, they would take the lumps of the sheaves and beat them against the basket or wherever it was they were beating them. And then they'd take the seeds that were left in the basket with all that chaff that came with it. They'd throw them up in the air, and the wind would blow away the chaff, but the seeds would be too heavy to be blown away, and they would drop back down in the basket. So they would take them up and down, up and down. And the only thing the chaff was good for, it would many times be blown into kind of a pile. They would rake it up and use it to help start their fires or to use it for cooking. That's all it was good for. God is saying that's the way Nineveh is. Nineveh's only good now to be burned up, to be destroyed. And they may think they're strong. And you stop and you think about this. In their time, their walls couldn't be breached. That couldn't be done. They didn't have these bombs and things like we do now that just tear a wall apart. And so when Nineveh was destroyed, God had a hand in it. The historians of that time tell us that a great flood came. Nineveh was situated on the Tigris River. A great flood came, and whereas the river had protected them before, protected their walls from being attacked on that side, the flood wiped out about 10 miles of their wall. And that's what allowed the Babylonians to go in and conquer. Look at verse 11. There is one come out of thee that imagineth evil against the Lord, a wicked counselor. One. There's one, he says, that comes out of thee. He imagines evil against the Lord. The word imagineth comes from kashab, and it means to think, to plan, to esteem, to calculate. Look at all these words that are used and picture them in a whole. To invent, to make a judgment, to imagine, to count. One was coming out of them who imagined that he could defeat God. One was coming out of them who was planning to defeat God. One was coming out of them who was calculating and trying to figure out, how do I defeat God? And thought they could. In other words, if we put it into one word, someone was scheming against God. Now, the question then arises, when someone schemed against God's people, did they realize that they were scheming against God? So is that what this text is trying to tell us? Whoever this was scheming against Judah, scheming about how they could cause them to fall. Because remember, in that time, when one nation defeated another, generally, except with regard to Israel, they were saying, our God is stronger than your God, and that's why we won. Did they realize that when they schemed against God's people, they were scheming against God? But then who was this one, this schemer? Is it a personification of all of the Assyrian kings as if they were one man? that might have fit. And you look at down through history, for instance, Sennacherib in 764 BC to 681 BC, he was one who schemed to destroy Jerusalem. He tried to do that in 702 and 701 BC, but he failed. Ashurbanipal in 699 and to 631 BC, he took King Manasseh into captivity. I believe that there was a possible schemer plotting against Jerusalem, the capital of Judah at this time, close to the time when Nineveh was about to be destroyed. To me, that fits, because a schemer who's against God's people, who Assyria had tried numerous times to defeat Jerusalem, and had always been thwarted. They're going to try again. But this time, God's going to step in, and Nineveh is going to be destroyed before they can initiate their plans. It really doesn't matter who it was, if it was one particular individual king of Assyria, or if it personifies all the kings. They had all fought against Israel and Judah. They had all tried to destroy God's people. Or if it was one particular one who was particularly evil. Doesn't matter. But notice this schemer is called what? A wicked counselor. Someone without profit. Somebody who was worthless. He was wicked. And whoever this counselor was, was it the counselors who counseled the king, or the king counseling his war generals? We don't know. But whoever it was, he appears to have been giving advice that would harm God's people. In verse 12, "Thus saith the Lord, though they be quiet, and likewise many, yet thus shall they be cut down when he shall pass through. Though I have afflicted thee, I will afflict thee no more." Pretty puzzling, isn't it? Thus saith the Lord. That makes it a fact. Thus saith the Lord, though they be quiet. Who's quiet? The word quiet here comes from a word that means complete, safe, and unharmed. Who was it that couldn't be harmed at this time? That thought they couldn't be harmed, thought that they were safe from any enemy. The American Standard Version here reads, thus saith Jehovah, though they be in full strength. I think that's more the idea. If you're incapable of being harmed, what are you? At full strength. The Young's literal translation reads, thus saith Jehovah, though complete. This is talking about their armies being at full strength, I believe. And though they were quiet, and likewise many, the thought's continuing, their size, their armies, though they be many, though they be large, though they be powerful, they can't win. They forgot something. God said, yet thus shall they be cut down. In my spare time, I've been reading a book about ancient warfare. And the idea of cut down it really has struck me because of that. When these armies were struck down, the sword would cut their legs out from under them, cut their sword arm, etc. This was the way that they caused an army to lose its strength. And when the army that was opposing them, when they saw a number of their people, many of their people, this happening to, it would take the heart out of the army, so to speak. They weren't willing to fight anymore. They would get to a point where they just figured this isn't worth it. And we're being beaten. We're being destroyed. This word is also used in the Hebrew writings to speak of sheep being sheared. That outer coat that kept them warm and protected them in the wintertime, sheared off in the springtime so they could use it to make yarn and clothes and stuff for the people. Figuratively then, it would be used to destroy an enemy. Brown, Driver, and Brown said that this word means to shear or to mow, that is, to be cut off completely, to be destroyed. Nineveh is pictured here as a sheared sheep. Their flaws and their weaknesses have now been exposed. You cut all the wool off of a sheep, you're exposing the skin of the sheep. If it has any flaws, now you can see them plainly. You may not be able to see them with all of these outer defenses that Nineveh had. You may not be able to see the weaknesses, but there are weaknesses. There are always weaknesses. When will all of this happen? When He shall pass through. Does the He here represent an individual or a nation? When He shall pass through, that whole phrase comes from one little bitty word, abar. When He crosses over, the word abar means to cross over. And it's used widely of a transaction that is being taken. When he crosses over the river to attack, when he crosses over the boundaries, when he crosses over the walls of defense. Brown, Driver, and Brown says it means to pass over or by or through. There's more the idea. You can pass over the walls, or you can pass through them by destroying them. You can pass by something. For instance, a fortified place set by the river can keep ships from passing through that they don't want to pass through by attacking them. But you can pass by an enemy and pass around them. So there seem to be two choices here as to the meaning of this phrase. Either the ruler of Assyria passing from the living to the dead, he's going to pass through, he's going to pass over. We sometimes sing a song about passing over Jordan. Well, what do we mean by that? Jordan represents the passage of death. We pass over from this life, when we sing those songs, into the next life. Or it can mean that Assyria's enemies are going to pass over the Tigris River to destroy Nineveh. And interestingly enough, that seems to be the primary meaning here, because again, this flood wiped out enough of the wall that the Babylonians were able to use the river to come into and to flood their armies into Nineveh, and that's how Nineveh was destroyed. I personally prefer that latter explanation, passing over the river. Even if you think about it from this standpoint, the Babylonians had to pass over the Euphrates and the Tigris to get to Nineveh. Though I have afflicted thee, I will afflict thee no more. The word I is important here. This could not refer to the Assyrian king. This part of the passage has to refer to someone else. Though I have afflicted thee, I will afflict thee no more. How had God afflicted Judah in the past? Hadn't it been with these Assyrian armies that God used to punish them because of their idolatry and their evil and wicked ways? Remember, Assyria took care of the northern 10 tribes of Israel because of their idolatry. Not one single good king came out of Israel, the northern 10 tribes, when they split and became 2 nations. Not one. All of them, every single one of them, the very first one of the first things he did when he pulled away all of the people from the tribe of Judah was to build idols. 2 of them, one into the north of the nation, one into the south. Why? Because he didn't want his people going back down to Jerusalem to worship, where they would be influenced by the true God and his followers. He wanted them to stop at those 2 idols and worship there. You don't need to go to Jerusalem to worship. But God had told his people they had to go to Jerusalem to worship, hadn't he? All idol worshipers, every single one of the kings. And it kept getting worse and worse, and finally, and what's interesting to me is if you study the historical evidence, at the time that northern Israel was destroyed, they were a very powerful military nation. And Assyria just cut through them like butter with a hot knife. Just destroyed them without hardly any possibility of them even beginning to defend themselves, and took them into captivity, spread them over all of the nations that they had formerly captured. But now we're talking about Judah. Nahum, remember, is not only something that is bad for Assyria, a prediction, but it's also good for Judah. It's something that ought to make them happy. Nineveh, your great foe, is going to be defeated. How had God afflicted Judah in the past? By using the Assyrians to attack them with their Assyrian armies. He had afflicted them. Why? Because of their idolatry, their adulteries, going after other gods, the many moral activities, immoral activities they were involved in, murder and theft and all of those things. And they needed to realize you can't do this and be faithful to God. Their affliction, Nahum is saying, by the Assyrians is about to end. It's going to be brought to an end. Waldron made a good statement, I think, here. He said, even at full strength and with their multitudes, the Assyrians will be cut down, and the one imagining evil and counseling wickedness will vanish. How true it was. Look at verse 23. 23, that should be 13, isn't it? For now will I break this yoke from off thee, and will burst thy bonds in sunder. We would say asunder today. What's the difference between break and burst? You ever thought about it? He uses both words here, and they are different original words. Break is shabar, and shabar means to burst, literally or figuratively, to break down. What happens when you break down an army? We're watching something right now that's going on in our world where the nation of Israel, as it's known today, and the nation of Iran are involved in war. And the Israelis, the first thing they did when they went in is they took out the radar units. Why? Because without the radar, they couldn't tell when the Israeli planes were coming in. They took out the airplanes, as many as they could, and they're still ongoing. But what were they doing? They were breaking down their enemy, making it where their enemy was less able to defend themselves and less able to attack them. It's a process. They're breaking them down. Slowly but surely, they are destroying their capability. Well, what has God been doing? He's breaking down the bursting the ability of the enemy so that they will not be able to attack his people. He's going to break in pieces. Baker Carpenter said that this is a verb meaning to break, to burst, to break in pieces, to break down, to break up, to smash, to shatter. In order to give Judah peace from their enemies, God's going to break down those enemies. God's going to do it. The word burst is a little different word, natak. It means to tear off. It's interesting to me that in the English they use the word burst for natak when instead of something like tear off or break, and notice in the word break in the English, it really means to burst or to break apart. And our English got it backwards. To tear off. He's going to tear off. Many times, again, when armies fight, if you can isolate some part of that army, it's easier to destroy that part of the army and thus make a tremendous disruption for the army as a whole. Baker Carpenter said that this means to break, to tear away, to pull away, to draw away. God's going to draw away their strength. And notice that when he does this, a double emphasis on the part of God to tear off the yoke of the Assyrian bondage. You're not going to be bothered by these people anymore. When I do this, God says, you will not be bothered by the Assyrians again. I think there's something here to remember that is of great importance. God is not telling Judah that they are never going to be under the yoke of bondage again. That's not what he's telling them. We know that Judah will be under the yoke of the Babylonian bondage in the future, again, because they didn't continue to stay with the lesson they learned by the Assyrians attacking them and putting them under bondage. They, like northern Israel, and with time forgot. They, like Nineveh, with time forgot and went back to their old ways. That's why Nineveh is going to be destroyed. They're later going to be under the Roman bondage. God's not telling Judah in this passage, you're never going to be under bondage again. Because we know they will. It's going to depend on them. It's going to depend on their actions. All of God's promises have an if or, except a few. But most of them have an if or. If you do this, then I will do this. But if you do this, then I'll do the opposite. In other words, if you obey me, then I'll protect you. I'll bless you. But if you refuse to obey me, then God said he'll curse them. He'll send punishment upon them to try and draw them back to be his faithful people. They're going to be in bondage to Babylon because they didn't learn their lesson. They're going to later be in bondage to Rome again because they didn't listen. And that magnificent temple is going to be utterly destroyed, which will also destroy any possibility of the law of Moses, the worship that it commanded, being in effect ever again. Look at verse 14. Oh, man. I hate it when I forget to move this thing. Give me just a second here. And the Lord hath given a commandment concerning thee, that no more of thy name be sown out of the house of thy gods. Will I cut off the graven image and the molten image? I will make thy grave, for thou art vile. Jehovah commands that Nineveh's influence no longer going to be sown. Their influence would never be scattered among the nations again. Nations as a whole, whether modern nations or ancient nations, would send out their representatives, whether they called them ambassadors or whatever, to have influence in other nations, their capitals. He's saying that's not going to happen anymore. You will never be allowed to scatter yourselves among the nations in order to influence them, in order to sow your doctrine, in order to sow disruption among them. Young's literal translation reads here, no more of thy name doth spread abroad. And that's really a good way to think about this. Their name's not going to be spread abroad. Oh, the Assyrians are coming. Oh, the Assyrians want you to do this. And they're powerful enough that if you don't do it, they may do something to you. Their influence, no more. The English Standard Version, which I'm not a great fan of, says, no more shall your name be perpetuated. And again, that is the right idea here. Interestingly, the pronouns in this verse are all masculine. And what that indicates is a nation, not an individual. Personal pronouns are used always with regard to an individual. This is a masculine. Feminine pronouns are used with regard to both male and female, talking about an individual. This is probably a king that's being talked about. But which one? Roper tells us this. One possibility is that this verse relates to Ashurbanipal, Syrian king, the last great king of Assyria, who reigned between 600 and 631 BC. He goes on to say another possibly is that the verse refers to Sin-shar-ishkun. I hope I got that halfway decent. The last Assyrian king to reign in Nineveh. Could it possibly refer to all of the kings that had reigned over Assyria? Out of the house of thy gods I will cut off the graven images. What's a graven image? A graven image is one that has been carved. Well, what's the difference between a graven image and a molten image? A molten image has been poured. You make a mold, and you take the metal and you heat it up and get it all hot and you pour it in and it molds it, and then when it comes out, it gets cool and hardens, then you buff it, you take off little flaws, scrape them off. There's a difference between the two. A graven image is something that's been molten and poured. The molten image is one that's poured. The graven image is something you start with and you carve out something. Out of the house of thy gods I will cut off thy graven image and the molten image. The EBC commentary says that something interesting was found here in the ruins by the archaeologists of Nineveh. They say that the temple of Nabu, a major deity of Nineveh, was razed to the ground and burned with ash from the blaze. Watch this though. The statue of Ishtar. Now Ishtar was a common god of the ancient world, a god of fertility, a female god, also a god of war in some cases. But the statue of Ishtar was discovered prostrate. What does that mean? Laying on the ground and headless. The head had been cut off. Out of the house of thy gods will I cut off the graven image and the molten image. It was discovered prostrate and headless amid the ruins of her temple, which had stood at Nineveh for almost 15 centuries. 1,500 years had stood there. I will make thy grave, for thou art vile. Nineveh, their rulers were vile. The deities which they worshiped were all vile. They committed their crimes in the name of their deities, their gods, their false gods. God said they were vile. That word means despicable. And when you think about something that's despicable, it's something you don't want to have anything to do with. They're going to become considered so vile and so despicable that the people will not want anything to do with them. That is, God's people. Their gods are despicable. Their worship to them caused them to be despicable. They'd shown contempt for God's people, and thus they were contemptible to God. That's how He looked at them. What or how does God look at us when we turn our back on Him, when we sin against Him? And none of us can say we're without sin. All of us sin from time to time. We try not to, but we do. And when we do, God looks at us as being despicable. And God, when He looks at a people and they will not turn back to Him, will destroy that people. He'll show them just how worthless they really are. That's why it's so important for us when we sin against our God, as soon as we realize it, to beg Him for forgiveness, to beg Him for His mercy, because we know we're weak. We're weak people. Their gods, their armies, their fortifications, their leaders are all powerless against the God of heaven. Look at verse 15. We'll try to finish this up as quickly as possible. Behold, upon the mountains the feet of him that bringeth good tidings, that publisheth peace. O Judah, keep thy solemn feasts, perform thy vows, for the wicked shall no more pass through thee. He is utterly cut off. Behold the mountains, the feet of him that bringeth good tidings. Does that remind us of Romans 10 and verse 15? How shall they preach except they be sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel of peace and bring glad tidings of good things. God is proclaiming there are good tidings coming. There's good news coming to you. Well, who's going to bring this good news to Judah? Is it Jehovah, the one he has chosen, Nahum? Or is it one who had been enslaved by Nineveh and who has escaped the destruction of Nineveh and runs to tell them about the tremendous destruction? Was it refuge from Nineveh's destruction? Whoever it was, God's behind it. God's letting them know, you're going to be safe now from this enemy. And notice what this messenger is going to proclaim. He's going to publish something. To hear intellectually. This word, publisheth, is interesting from the standpoint that it's talking about something that has been heard intellectually, with an implication of attention being paid to what is heard. Brown Driver and Brown says that it's a verb meaning to hear, to obey, to listen to be heard of, to be regarded, to cause to hear, to proclaim, to sound aloud. We normally think of the word publisheth as if something's going to be put out for consumption, whether it be verbally or a written book or something of that nature. But this word publisheth here is primarily dealing with listening intellectually to what has been proclaimed in the past. The one who comes pronouncing Nineveh's destruction is going to be like a herald. The term herald is interesting. It's the word that's used of proclaiming the gospel by men. Herald. These were men who had been chosen by a king to take a message, some proclamation that he's made, and take it out to the city, and everywhere he goes, proclaim it loudly. And it's an indication that all who hear the message are to obey it. A herald of the king, issuing commands, heralds. Judah is now being called upon to keep the solemn feast, to perform thy vows. The idea of the solemn feast is used throughout the Old Testament to refer to the major feast of the Hebrew religious calendar. There were three primarily that had to be obeyed. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, where the men had to go to Jerusalem, the Passover, but there were also those like the weeks, tabernacles, etc. These had to be fulfilled. The Hebrews, he says, needed to keep their vows. Had they not been keeping them? Had they not been keeping their promises that they had made to God? And is Assyria somehow related in having done something to keep them from the ability to keep these feasts? Whatever it is, God's saying, I'm going to free you. Now keep your feast. Whether they had been unable to in the past or whether they had neglected them, keep your feast. Keep your vows. And what there seems to be here is an implication that somehow the Assyrian armies had affected Judah's feast days. God says, the wicked, they're no more going to pass through you. The wicked, those without profit, those who are worthless. What did we notice earlier? The idols, those who worship the idols are worthless. They're not going to pass through you anymore. Baker Carpenter tells us that there's often a strong moral component in this context, and suggesting the state of being good for nothing, and therefore expresses the concept of wickedness. If something's good for nothing, it's wicked. Assyria, its kings, its armies have been wicked. They're no longer going to be able to pass through Judah. This was good news. Judah was probably celebrating. Why? Why is he no longer going to pass through? He is utterly cut off. There won't be any more good little Assyrians being born. Why? Because the people have been cut off. They're no longer capable of raising up the children that would be needed to be warriors, to pass through the nations, influencing them. When Nahum wrote these things, Judah would probably have said, when is this going to happen? After all, Nineveh still stood at this time. Remember that. Nineveh spoke, or Nahum spoke as if Nineveh had already been destroyed. They've been cut off. But the fact was the city still stood. Their armies, the Assyrian armies, still stood. He's speaking of the future, but notice something. He is speaking as if it is already a reality. How could he do that? Because in God's mind, it was a reality. This is just as certain as if it had happened right now. They are going to be destroyed, and you're not going to be bothered by these people anymore. Next week we'll come back and we'll start chapter 2.